Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for June 5th, 2023. Well, in the last 24 hours, the U.S. has admitted what everyone knew was the case, which is that U.S. weapons and equipment was used in the cross-border raid into Russia conducted by Ukrainian neo-Nazi units. Now, this is an example of why the U.S. is not trusted. Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, has said repeatedly that Ukraine has promised, under pressure from the United States, not to use U.S. weapons to engage in battles in Russia. Well, apparently the Ukrainians aren't listening to Blinken. But I want to take a look at this whole question of who is Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, and what's he thinking? And maybe perhaps what's he drinking? Because this is a man who is not to be trusted, as you'll see from the discussion that I'm going to present today, including, again, quoting him and what he intends to do. He just gave a speech in Helsinki in Finland on June 2nd, welcoming the nation to NATO. And he described Finland's membership in NATO as a, quote, sea change, unquote, resulting from Russian aggression against Ukraine. Now, it would take much longer than the time I have allotted for a usual update to go into full detail on both the disinformation, the lying, and the dishonesty that typifies him, as well as the omissions. But what you can see is the arrogant triumphalism of Blinken in welcoming Finland to NATO. So let's take a look at some of what he said. He started by talking, well, essentially, he rewrote history, treating Putin's Russia as Stalin's Soviet Union, and then talking about Stalin's Soviet Union as though it were Nazi Germany. The man's a little bit confused here, but he's talking about how in World War II, the Finns experienced an invasion by the Soviet Union, and how this helped shape the thinking in Finland, which convinces them that they cannot trust Putin today. Well, he left out something important, which is that from 1941 to 1944, Finland was working with Nazi Germany in its invasion of the Soviet Union, including the siege of Leningrad or St. Petersburg, that led to starvation deaths, large number of casualties, and marked a generation of Russian citizens as anti-fascist. Including among the victims was the older brother of Vladimir Putin, who he never met because he died during the siege of Leningrad. Now, it's a kind of big omission to leave out what Finland was doing there. But then he goes on to even a bigger fallacy of composition, which is a polite way of saying lying. He talked about the, quote, strategic failure of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Here's what he said. When you look at President Putin's long-term strategic aims and objectives, there's no question Russia is significantly worse off today than it was before its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, militarily, economically, geopolitically. Now, I think there are many competent military and political experts who would contradict what Blinken's saying, but let's go on, let's hear more. Where Putin aimed to project strength, he's revealed weakness. Where he sought to divide, he's united. What he tried to prevent, he's precipitated. Now, this idea of weakness, economic weakness because of the sanctions and so on. In fact, the Russian economy is doing better than all of the economies of Western Europe. It's not been weakened. It's not been crushed. Its trade is increased. It's working with many nations to move away from a dollar system. When he says that he's sought to divide, he's united. Well, most of the world is united, but not with the United States and NATO, not with the warhawks, and I'll get to that in a moment. Then he goes on to say that the U.S. is fully backing Ukraine and will into the end of the Russian invasion. And he said, Ukraine needs a vibrant, prosperous democracy within its border. That's the path the Ukrainian people voted for when they won their independence in 1991, what they defended in the Maidan in 2004 and again in 2013. A free and open society with respect for human rights and the rule of law, fully integrated with Europe, where all Ukrainians have the dignity and opportunity to realize their full potential, and where the government responds to the needs of its people, not to those of vested interests and elites. What poppycock! How far off could he be? What freedom and democracy? The Ukraine only is surviving by having the West pay its government bills and provide massive amounts of weapons. The corruption of Ukraine is well known. The shutting down of any opposition is the opposite of freedom and democracy. As for the isolation of Russia, this is where you see how delusional the arrogant Mr. Blinken is. Just as a couple of examples on the so-called isolation of Russia. The BRICS foreign ministers meeting in South Africa showed the opposite. There are now more than 20 nations applying for membership in the BRICS. The BRICS, the two major partners are Russia and China, both of whom Blinken is fulminating against, but also Brazil, India, and South Africa. When Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, went to this foreign ministers meeting, at pre-meetings he went to Kenya, Burundi, Mozambique, and South Africa. In each of these places he was given a warm welcome. There were trade agreements and investment programs worked out. The exact opposite of what Blinken's talking about. Now, meanwhile, Blinken, Vice President Harris, and the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba have visited African nations recently. What they attempted to do was to convince the African nations by strong-arming, by bribing, by threatening, that they must support the sanctions against Russia. And they all came up empty-handed because the African nations are not supporting the efforts by the colonial nations, the former colonial powers, to impose their rules on the African countries. In fact, typical of this is the response of the foreign minister of Burundi, and that's Albert Shingiro. And what Shingiro said is, quote, "We are a sovereign nation, so we are free to choose our partners while taking into consideration the interests of our populations." It's a little more polite than the South African Foreign Minister, Naledi Pandor, who told Blinken to his face, "We will not tolerate your bullying." The almost exact words from several other African leaders. Now, meanwhile, when Lavrov was there, plans were firmed up for a Russian-Africa economic summit in St. Petersburg at the end of July. In Cape Town, Lavrov met with a group called the Friends of the BRICS. This included Argentina, Bangladesh, Cuba, Gabon, the Congo, Egypt, Indonesia, Iran, Kazakhstan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Isolated, Mr. Blinken? I don't think so. Now, this was the theme of an article by the journalist Patrick Lawrence that appeared in Consortium News at the end of May. The title is "Deaf but Not Blind to U.S. Decline." And I'm going to just quote a little bit from this article. It's well worth reading because it gets right at the delusions at the center of Blinken's ravings. Lawrence says, "And so I ask, after reviewing the fact that all these countries are refusing to go along with NATO," Lawrence says, "I ask, can I be the only one to wonder whether those shaping and conducting American foreign policy are blind to this immense global shift, or deaf to what the non-West lately has to say to the West, or too stupid to understand events, or in denial, or maybe some of all four?" And he's basically talking about the moves against the dollar system and moves toward using national currencies for trade and investment, and the refusal to support the U.S. sanctions regime. So Lawrence goes on and says, blind, deaf, stupid, in gutless denial. This last is a subset of stupid. Each of these explanations has its temptations as we assess the cognitive capacities of the elites who sequester themselves inside the Washington Beltway. He continues, but it has been awfully hard to settle with certainty on the cause of our policy people's apparent inability or refusal to acknowledge that world history has entered a period of epochal change. And he concludes it's neither blind nor stupid, but deaf and in denial. Now, in this context, just very briefly, a little bit about what the pedigree of Blinken. He comes from the Zbigniew-Brzezinski school. Madeleine Albright served under Biden in the Obama administration, allied with the neocon warhawk Victoria Nuland, close to Hillary Clinton. In fact, he was a key operative in Biden's campaign in 2020. Now, he gave full support to the Libyan war, full support as Biden did to the Iraq war. In fact, he called for a more aggressive response in Syria. Now, here are some quotes from an article he wrote for the Washington Post, which was later posted on the Brookings site in January 2019. He wrote, "Force can be a necessary adjunct to effective diplomacy. In Syria, we rightly sought to avoid another Iraq by not doing too much, but we made the opposite error of doing too little." Now, what's he talking about? The U.S. was allied with Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria, trying to enforce regime change against the Assad government. Biden and Blinken still support brutal sanctions against the Syrian population, including after the earthquake threatened a whole section of northern Syria. And he continues to support the U.S. troops that are occupying 1/3 of the Syrian territory. Do you know who his co-author was in this article? Mr. Victoria Nuland, Robert Kagan, who became one of Obama's favorite neocons. He's the chief spokesman now, Blinken, for the so-called rules-based order. If he doesn't speak for you, then you should register and help us build for our June 10th event to show the real side of the potential for America from looking at the June 10th, 1963 speech by John F. Kennedy, which was a rejection of everything that Antony Blinken stands for. Hello, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Support our independence to produce videos like these. Become a member of the LaRouche organization at thelarouche.org/member. By becoming a member for $25 or more, you'll get special access to the EIR Alert Daily Briefing and Weekly Magazine, which is what I read to stay on top of things.